Hey everyone, did you know that over 90% of you watching right now haven't hit that subscribe button yet? If you're enjoying our stories about real-life gangsters, take just a second to subscribe. It's free, and it really helps us keep bringing you more true gangster tales every day. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into another story from the world of the mob. The Louisiana night had a hum to it, the kind of deep, lazy rhythm that made even the streetlights look half asleep. Out on the edge of New Orleans, where the swamp breathed and the air smelled of moss and secrets, a man named Carlos Marcello sat on the porch of a weather-beaten house, tapping the ash from his cigarette into a chipped glass. He didn't look like the sort of man people whispered about. He was short, soft-spoken, eyes half-lidded and patient, the kind of man who seemed to listen longer than he should. But anyone who'd done business in the French Quarter knew better. The smaller Carlos looked, the bigger the space he took up in a room. Tonight, the crickets were loud, and the world felt almost peaceful, except for the low rumble of a car pulling up on the dirt road. The headlights flashed once, then went out. Carlos didn't move. He just watched. A tall figure stepped out. Raymond, one of his oldest associates. His voice carried that mix of Cajun drawl and city edge. "You hear what they're saying about you, boss?" Carlos flicked the cigarette into the dark. "I try not to listen to rumors I didn't start." Raymond grinned, but his eyes were uneasy. "Word is the feds are sniffing around again. They say Bobby Kennedy's got your name in his mouth more than his wife's." Carlos chuckled low, almost kindly. "That boy's been trying to clean up the country since he learned how to spell it. Let him try." Raymond shifted his weight. "This ain't like before, Carlos. They mean business now." "I always mean business," Carlos said softly. "That's why they talk about me and not the other way around." He stood, straightened his coat, and looked out toward the city lights glowing faintly beyond the trees. "Tell the boys we're gonna lay low. No noise, no mess. When the law starts listening, you play music they can't hear." Raymond nodded. "And if they come down here anyway?" Carlos smiled, that slow, knowing smile. "Then we show 'em how polite New Orleans can be." By dawn, the bayou was silver with fog. Carlos drove alone into the city, windows down, the scent of river water thick in the air. The French Quarter was still half asleep, shopkeepers setting out chairs, old women sweeping stoops, a jazz tune floating from a cafe radio. He parked on Chartres Street and stepped into a narrow building where the sign read, Marcello Import Company. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and ledgers. On paper, it was a shipping business, crates of fruit, textiles, and olive oil. In truth, it was a heartbeat disguised as an address. Carlos sat behind his desk, flipped open the morning paper. Justice Department ramps up efforts against organized crime. He read it twice, slow. Then he smiled. "They never learn," he murmured. His secretary, a young woman named Rita, knocked lightly on the door. "Mr. Marcello, there's a man here says he's from Chicago." Carlos didn't look up. "They always say that. Send him in." The man who entered wore a tan suit and the kind of grin that belonged to a salesman, not a killer. But Carlos knew what lay under that grin: ambition. The stranger offered a hand. "Mr. Marcello, name's Tony. I bring greetings from Mr. Giancana." Carlos took the hand lightly. "Then tell Sam I said hello, and tell him the Mississippi's wide for a reason." Tony blinked. He figured maybe you'd like to talk business, something bigger, shared opportunities. Carlos leaned back. "Bigger means louder, and I like quiet." Tony hesitated. "Sometimes quiet men get left behind." Carlos smiled thinly. "Sometimes loud men get found first." He motioned toward the door. "You tell your boss I've got everything I need down here. Sunlight, patience, and a city that knows how to mind its manners." Tony gave a polite nod and left, though his smile had faded by the time he hit the street. When the door closed, Carlos lit another cigarette and stared out the window. The city stretched before him, crooked streets, soft, music and the slow pulse of commerce. He'd built this empire not on noise but on rhythm. Every deal, every handshake, every silence had its place. But even he could feel it now. The wind shifting. The government was louder, the outsiders were hungrier, and the old codes that kept men in line were starting to crack like the paint on the quarter's old balconies. He exhaled smoke and whispered, "Storm's coming again." But he smiled as he said it, because storms didn't frighten him. They reminded him that even the sky had to bend sometimes, and when it did, Carlos Marcello was always ready. The river carried a different kind of hush when the sun wasn't quite up yet, like it was thinking over everything it had seen and deciding what to keep. Carlos Marcello liked those minutes best. He'd drive the levee road with the windows cracked, the scent of brackish water and magnolia drifting in, and let the city organize itself into the neat little boxes he preferred. People thought power meant noise. He knew better. Power was inventory. It was schedules and faces, favors and clocks. By the time the quarter blinked awake, he was already at the import office with coffee cooling beside a row of ledger books. Rita came in with the day's mail bound in twine and a look that said at least one envelope wasn't from a friend. "Washington?" he asked, without glancing up. "Return address says Department of Justice," she said, placing it on the blotter. "They never send flowers," Carlos murmured. He slid a letter opener under the flap and read the stiff language that said nothing kind and everything clear. A subpoena. A hint at an upcoming hearing. A suggestion he should make himself available to discuss matters of public concern. He folded the paper once, then again, until it was small enough to vanish into his jacket pocket. "Public concern," he said. "They always use church words when they want to bless a beating." "You want me to call Mr. Raymond?" Rita asked. "No," he said softly. "Let the day pretend to be normal a little longer." He flipped the ledgers, penciling neat notations, adding up columns the way a gambler keeps score no matter who's holding the cards. Bananas from Honduras. Fabrics from Veracruz. Freight routes that touched the river like polite greetings. To anyone else, it looked like a tidy business. To him, it was a map of loyalties, who owed a phone call, who needed a favor, who deserved silence. The phone rang, 2 short pulses, the courtesy code for locals. He lifted the receiver. "Yes." "It's Raymond," the voice came, easy and low. "We've got a gentleman from the paper standing on Chartres, swearing he's just doing a human interest piece. Says your story will sell copy." "Everything sells copy," Carlos said. "Please sell him a beignet and send him off to write about the weather." He hung up and stood, stretching the stiffness out of his shoulders. From the window, he watched a streetcar chime and crawl past the iron lace of balconies. Tourists wandered with cameras. A saxophone practiced 2 courtyards over, scales and little runs of melody that made the morning feel like it had a heartbeat. At 10, he walked to a corner cafe where the chairs always scraped the floor with the same friendly complaint. The owner, a thin man with sleeves to his elbows, slid a demitasse his way. "You hear the radio, Mr. Marcello? Up in Washington, they're saying they're tired of corruption. They're coming down hard." "They always say they're coming," Carlos said. "The trick is not to be at the address they announce." The owner chuckled, leaning closer. "My cousin says Bobby Kennedy's on the radio every other day like a preacher with a new sermon. He's got your name ready for the homily." Carlos blew on the coffee, unbothered. "The boy likes clean rooms. I'm not offended." "You don't sound nervous." "Nerves are for people who can't read their own calendars." He paid, tipped too much, and stepped back into the bright wash of Gulf. Light. Outside, a man in a suit he didn't recognize stood with his hands in his pockets, studying a map as if maps told the truth. Outsider, Carlos thought without malice. The city would introduce itself to him soon enough. By noon, he was upriver in a low building with a tin roof that ticked in the heat. It smelled of citrus and rope, of burlap and river wind. Raymond met him on the loading dock. "We put a man down at the courthouse," he said. "They're scheduling hearings. They want you in a chair answering polite questions." "We all want things," Carlos said. "I want the Saints to win. and for people to stop overcooking redfish. Raymond smirked. And the feds? They want to say a name on television, Carlos replied. Give them someone else's. Politely. They walked the aisles, nodding at men who pretended not to look, who respected the way he paid on Fridays and remembered first names. He paused near a crate stenciled with an Orchards brand, tapped the wood with 2 fingers and said to nobody in particular, shipments change, seasons change, but schedules never lie. By afternoon, the heat pushed people into shade. The city took a slower breath, and the river replied with its own. Carlos held court at a small table in a quiet restaurant. No reservations, no linen. Tables cleared with a towel that had lived 100 lives. A judge's aide stopped by for coffee. A union man nodded hello. A priest tapped him once on the shoulder and said nothing at all. In New Orleans, the orchestra rehearsed in public and performed behind closed doors. You sure you don't want to leave town a spell? Raymond asked when they stepped back into the street. Lay low looks a lot like Gulf breezes. I was born far away, Carlos said. But this is where the ground knows my steps. I don't run from my own porch. They crossed toward Jackson Square as a cloud shouldered the sun and gave the square to the breeze. A child chased pigeons and clapped when they lifted like confetti. A brass trio tried a melody, missed, tried again, found it. Rhythm. Always rhythm. That evening brought a different kind of invitation. A dinner in a garden behind a shotgun house where the live oaks wore their shawls of Spanish moss, and strangers could become cousins if the food was right. Men from Texas had come in with ideas about oil money and boats that could move anything to anywhere, fast. They talked big, grinned big, and left their plates too full. We can help each other, the largest one said, patting his napkin like it owed him an apology. You got the docks, we got the dollars. Carlos smiled as if money were a joke he had already heard. Dollars travel, he said, but manners don't. And down here, manners are currency. The Texan laughed too loud. We're all friends here. Then you won't mind doing favors for free, Carlos replied, and sipped his wine. The laughter thinned. He left before dessert. On his porch that night, the crickets took up their argument and the frogs provided a rhythm section. Rita had left a note on the hall table, handwriting small and neat. Call came from a senator's office. Staffer said, informal and off the record. Wants lunch Wednesday. He penciled a yes. He penciled a place. He penciled a time early enough that anyone watching would be late. Sleep found him like it always did. Reluctant at first, then grateful. He dreamed, if he dreamed, in ledgers and latitudes. The morning brought rain that didn't cool anything. He took it as a benediction, a sign that the city approved of slowness. In the office, Rita shifted a stack of folders and said, We had visitors, 2 men with awful ties. They asked nice questions. How nice? They said please before every threat. Give them a receipt, Carlos said, then sell them an umbrella. Near noon, a radio in the next room coughed and cleared and produced a voice fresh as a barber's chair. The Attorney General himself promising to root out the rot, to bring sunlight where shadows had squatted for too long. Names were not named. Everyone heard the names anyway. Carlos turned the volume down so the speech became texture instead of message. He believes in washing, he said mildly, but it's hard to scrub a river. Raymond came in with a folder and a face that understood weather. Chicago called again, he said. They'd like to help you with your Kennedy problem. I don't have a problem, Carlos corrected. I have a schedule. You know what they mean. I do, and I know what they don't. Tell them New Orleans is a different language. Tell them we clap on 2 and 4. Raymond grinned despite himself. They'll think that's a code. It is, Carlos said. For no thank you. Late afternoon pulled long shadows across the quarter. A man in a crisp suit, FBI by the angle of the hat and the scuff on the shoes, stood under an awning pretending to admire antiques. Carlos stepped from his doorway as if leaving a church. Beautiful day, the agent said, tipping his brim. Every day is, if you squint, Carlos replied. Mind a question? Always, Carlos said with a polite smile. The agent tried another angle. You planning any travel? Every man travels in his thoughts, Carlos said. Mine like to stay home. Washington would appreciate your cooperation. New Orleans appreciates everyone's appreciation, Carlos said, and moved along, not hurried, not slow, just the invisible tempo of a man who didn't need to prove he owned his time. That night, the Gulf sent a breeze up the river, and the city forgave the day its heat. Carlos met an old friend at a neighborhood bar where the floors knew every shoe and the jukebox leaned permanently toward melancholy. They spoke in generalities: supply, demand, who was making mistakes, who was making amends. When the conversation dipped toward rumor, he lifted a hand and let silence do the correcting. You really think you can wait out the Kennedys? His friend asked at last. I don't wait out men, Carlos said. I wait out moods. And the mood now? National, he said. It'll pass. They always do. The trick is not to be the story they think they're telling. He walked home by a route older than his paperwork, past porches where elders rocked, and watched him pass with that vague nod that said they had seen him for years and never once feared the night because he was in it. He took the steps two at a time, habit from other lives, then paused at the door, listening to the chorus of insects and faraway saxophone. On his desk, the subpoena waited like a square of ice. He placed a glass on it. He made a list on a pad: names, calls, timings, the choreography of staying uninteresting. He underlined 2 words: be early. Morning would bring another letter. Afternoon, another offer dressed as advice. Evening, another chance to choose the exact size of his silence. For now, he allowed himself the small luxury of imagining the Mississippi as a ledger that could never be audited. It ran how it ran. It carried what it carried. It forgave what it could and drowned the rest. The phone rang once, only once, and then stopped. A signal from Raymond. The courthouse calendar had moved. The hearing would be sooner than promised. Carlos smiled, like a man who hears thunder and counts between flash and echo. All right, he said to the empty room. We'll dance. He clicked off the lamp. The house breathed. The bayou sang its sleepy hymn. And out past the cane and cypress, the city tightened its tie for the next polite confrontation. A chair, a microphone, and the quietest man in Louisiana taking his place as if he'd booked the room himself. The courthouse smelled faintly of floor polish and nerves. Cameras hummed somewhere outside, too polite to enter yet, and the marble corridors collected every footstep like gossip. Carlos Marcello stood just inside the double doors, hat in hand, eyes half-lidded, looking like a man waiting for a train that would be late. Anyway, a clerk guided him toward a chair under the hot lights. Just answer the question, sir. Straightforward as you can, the clerk said, voice kind enough to make the warning sound like advice. Carlos nodded once. Straightforward's the only road worth walking. When the hearing started, the senators tried their best at charm. Mr. Marcello, one began, reading from a paper. It says here, you operate an import business, but our records show several discrepancies. Could you explain those? Carlos folded his hands on the table, steady. Paperwork gets confused sometimes, he said. You ever try to fill out a shipping manifest in August? Ink melts, so do tempers. Laughter rippled through the gallery. The senator didn't smile. And what about these accounts under different names? Carlos shrugged. Everybody's got cousins. You should meet mine sometime. A younger senator leaned forward, eyes sharp. Do you deny your associations with known criminals? Carlos let the silence breathe. I associate with everyone who pays their bills and minds their manners. A murmur ran through the room. He could feel the microphones leaning closer. The next question came harder. Mr. Marcello, are you saying you have no involvement in illegal activities whatsoever? He looked straight into the senator's eyes, voice calm as a river before a storm. Senator, in New Orleans, the only illegal thing is bad cooking. Even the stenographer paused to smother a laugh. The chairman rapped his gavel. Mr. Marcello, this is serious business. Carlos's smile didn't fade. So is mine, sir. By the time the session ended, he'd given them nothing but charm and metaphors, leaving them frustrated, dazzled, and unsure if they'd been mocked or complimented. Outside, the cameras flashed like summer lightning. Reporters shouted his name, throwing questions like pebbles. Carlos, did you pay off the city council? Did you threaten a judge? He paused long enough for the shutters to click. Boys, he said gently, you make it sound like I run the weather. The laughter followed him down the courthouse steps. That night, back in his office, Raymond was pacing. You shouldn't tease them like that, he said. They don't take kindly to being made fools of. They did that themselves, Carlos said, loosening his tie. All I did was let them hear their own echoes. They'll come harder next time. They always do. Carlos poured himself a small glass of bourbon and watched the ice sweat. You know the difference between a storm and a hurricane, Ray? Raymond frowned. Wind. Timing, Carlos said. A storm hits too early. It's a warning. A hurricane waits until you stop looking up. He raised the glass, letting the amber catch the light. They think I'm a storm. The next morning, the papers were full of him. New Orleans businessman stonewalls committee. Marcello dodges. Questions with a smile. He read every headline, then neatly folded the paper and slid it into a drawer with the others. Rita watched him from the doorway. You actually collect those? They're souvenirs, he said. Proof I existed in someone else's imagination. Outside, the rain began again, soft and steady. Ray says there's talk from Chicago, she said. They think you've embarrassed them. Carlos smiled faintly. Chicago embarrasses itself every other week. Tell Ray to let them cool off. Send fruit baskets if it makes him feel polite. By afternoon, the storm rolled in for real. Thunder crawling across the sky, the streets shining slick with reflection. Carlos sat on his porch again, watching the rain blur the horizon. Rita's voice came from inside. Phone's been ringing all day. Reporters, friends, strangers. Even a priest called, says he's praying for you. Carlos chuckled. Tell him to pray for the senator. He looked like he needed it more. The laughter faded into the rhythm of rain. In the distance, a train whistle rose and fell, long and low. The kind of sound that reminded him of Sicily, the docks, the salt, the promise of leaving. He whispered to himself, every city's the same after midnight. Only the accents change. Lightning flashed. The thunder waited, then answered. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. They think they can drag me into their spotlight, he murmured. But they don't understand. New Orleans was never a city of light. It's a city of shadows. And somewhere beyond the rain, the city hummed its slow secret tune, the one only the patient could hear. The first cool front of fall rolled into New Orleans like a sigh. It took the edge off the heat, but brought with it a strange stillness, the kind that made dogs restless and gamblers careful. Carlos Marcello sat at his office window, watching the rain taper into mist over the quarter's rooftops. He had the radio turned low, just enough to hear the hum of static between songs. Somewhere a man was talking about him again. Organized crime, the announcer said, smooth and certain. A shadow government controlling our cities. Names we've heard before, and one name we'll be hearing again. Carlos Marcello, the so-called boss of the bayou. Carlos turned the dial until the voice faded to static. People like to think there's a single villain, he said aloud. Makes the world smaller. Rita appeared in the doorway with a folder clutched to her chest. You're on the cover of Time magazine, she said. Tell them I don't keep subscriptions. They're saying Kennedy's coming south himself this time, she added, almost whispering. Carlos tapped ash from his cigarette. Then we'll make sure he gets a proper welcome. Gumbo and a brass band. Rita hesitated. And subpoenas? He smiled faintly. Those two. That evening he met Raymond at a quiet bar near the docks. The place smelled of salt, wood polish, and secrets too old to bother hiding. A single jazz trumpet wailed somewhere in the corner, notes soft enough not to interrupt conversation. You hear about this thing in Washington? Raymond asked, leaning in. Word is they're building a whole task force for you. Not the city. You. Carlos stirred his drink, watching the ice spin. They'll call it something fancy. Justice always wears new shoes. This ain't funny, boss. They're saying deportation again. Carlos smiled thinly. They've been deporting me since the day I arrived. You think they'll actually do it? He looked up, eyes calm and unreadable. The law likes paper. I like people. Paper can be rewritten. Raymond sighed. You ever get tired of this dance? I get tired of the music, Carlos said, but I like the floor. Back at his house that night, the air felt heavy. Cicadas buzzed in the trees and the porch light flickered like it was thinking of quitting. Carlos sat with a glass of bourbon, staring at the darkness beyond the yard. Somewhere in the distance, the city hummed like a living thing. He thought of his childhood in Sicily, of fields too dry to grow anything but trouble, of leaving home with nothing but a last name and a promise. He'd built an empire brick by brick, handshake by handshake. Not with violence, not at first, but with patience, the kind that made other men rush. And yet here it was again, the sound of power shifting, slow and inevitable. The next morning, he drove to the airport. The terminal smelled of fuel and coffee. 2 federal agents were waiting by the gate, stiff as church pews. Mr. Marcello, one said, flashing a badge. We're here to escort you for a meeting in Washington. Carlos adjusted his tie. Isn't that nice of you? I didn't even pack a bag. You won't need one. They walked him down the jetway like a dignitary instead of a suspect. Passengers watched, whispering. Carlos smiled at a small boy holding his mother's hand. Don't believe everything they print, kid, he said. Washington smelled nothing like home. The marble and steel felt colder. The air, too clean. In a small conference room, men in dark suits waited behind folders. A young man with sharp eyes and a Boston accent leaned forward. Mr. Marcello, you're a long way from Louisiana, the man said. Not far enough, Carlos replied. I'm Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the man continued. I've been looking into your activities. I hope you find something interesting, Carlos said. Kennedy's jaw tightened. You think this is a joke? I think it's a long trip for coffee. You've corrupted a city. I built one, Carlos said softly. You just don't like how it runs. Kennedy's hand hit the table, the sound sharp as a gavel. You're not untouchable. Carlos met his eyes without blinking. Neither are you, Mr. Kennedy. But we're both polite enough not to test it. The silence after that stretched until it snapped. Kennedy stood, red in the face. Get him out of here. They put him on a small plane that didn't land where it should have. He felt the engines change pitch, the sudden tilt, the drop. When it touched down, the air was hotter, thicker, and the signs outside were in Spanish. The agent opened the door, motioning. Welcome home, Mr. Marcello. Carlos stepped onto the tarmac and looked around. Guatemala. He smiled slowly. You should have brought sunscreen. It took him 3 weeks to find his way back. 3 weeks of rain-soaked roads, borrowed names, and nights spent listening to the jungle sing. When he finally crossed into Mexico, he bought a suit, a hat, and a first-class ticket to Houston under another man's name. By the time he reached New Orleans, the papers were calling it an embarrassment for the government. Deported mafia boss returns to U.S. undetected. One headline read. Carlos poured himself a drink and laughed. They wanted me gone, he told Raymond. Now I'm everywhere. Raymond shook his head. You should lay low for a while. Carlos looked out the window, at the neon glow of Bourbon Street, at the city that had adopted him because no one else wanted to. "You can't hide from what you are," he said softly, "and I'm this city's reflection." He turned back, glass raised. "Let them come again. I've got manners left." The band down the block struck up a tune, slow and swinging, the kind of music that sounded like memory. Carlos smiled. New Orleans never loses its rhythm. He took a long drink, listening as thunder rolled again across the river, the city's applause for the man who'd outlasted the law, at least for now. When he returned, New Orleans greeted him the only way it knew how, with humidity thick enough to chew and gossip quick enough to outrun a taxi. The newspapers printed pictures of the Attorney General looking grim, and people at cafes whispered about the little man who had walked himself back into the country like it was his front yard. Carlos Marcello didn't bother correcting any of it. He moved through the city like a shadow that had never left. The same office, the same chair, the same rhythm. Coffee at 8, phone calls at 9, quiet at noon. Even the pigeons on the wires seemed relieved to see him again. Raymond came into the office with a stack of ledgers and a face that said he hadn't slept much. "You know they're still talking about it, boss. They can't figure out how you got back." Carlos was looking out the window at a man washing his car in the street. "Some things ain't meant to be figured out," he said. "You're famous now," Raymond pressed. "They're saying you made the government look like amateurs." Carlos turned, his smile calm as ever. "Fame is a poor disguise for peace, Ray. Let them talk. Talking's free." He poured 2 cups of coffee, handed one over. "What about our friends? Everyone still playing nice?" "Mostly. Chicago's quiet. New York sent word. Respect, they said. But..." Carlos raised an eyebrow. "But?" Raymond lowered his voice. "They're watching you closer now. They think you've gotten too comfortable." Carlos laughed, softly. "Comfort makes people sloppy. I'm not comfortable, Ray. I'm home." That night he took his car out past the quarter, down toward the swamp where the city lights melted into fog. He liked to drive there when the world got too loud. The road wound through cypress trees and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth. He parked near the water's edge and lit a cigarette, the ember glowing red in the dark. The frogs were loud, the kind of chorus that didn't care who listened. He thought about the boy he'd once been, the immigrant who had stepped off a boat in a foreign land with dirt on his boots and nothing in his pockets. He thought about how easy it was to mistake survival for destiny. Behind him, a car engine purred. Headlights cut through the mist. Raymond stepped out, jacket collar turned up. "You should be resting, boss." Carlos didn't turn. Rest is for men who plan to stop moving. "I got news," Raymond said, joining him by the water. "The boys in Washington are still circling. New name this time. Operation Hard Hat." "Sounds fancy." Carlos smirked. They like titles that sound like work. Keeps them from noticing they're just rearranging the same furniture. Raymond laughed, then turned serious. "You ever think about walking away? Really walking away?" Carlos took a long drag, exhaled smoke into the night. "Every morning before coffee, every night before sleep. And every time I ask myself who'd run this city if I didn't. Then I remember all the wrong answers." They stood there a long while, 2 silhouettes against the swamp, the sound of insects filling the air like applause. Days became weeks. Washington moved on to other headlines, but Carlos knew better. Pressure never really left. It just changed its angle. The city had changed too. Younger men were making noise, slicker, faster, hungrier. They talked about modernization, about bringing in Las Vegas investors and new partners from out west. One afternoon, a young man named Tony Romano came to see him. Fresh suit, restless eyes, the kind of energy that burned through patience. "Mr. Marcello," Tony began, "we appreciate everything you've built. But times are different now. The city's growing, the country's changing. We should be changing too." Carlos listened, fingers tapping once against the desk. "You ever dance, Tony?" The young man blinked. "Dance?" "Yeah. You ever lead a waltz? Tony shook his head. When you lead, Carlos said, you don't pull the other person. You move first, then wait for them to follow. Too fast, you step on toes. Too slow, you lose the rhythm. Either way, the song ends early. Tony looked embarrassed but didn't move. With respect, sir, this ain't dancing. It's business. It's all dancing, Carlos said softly. Only the floor changes. He stood, walked to the window, looked out over the rooftops of his city. Go home, Tony. Learn the rhythm before you try to change it. When the young man left, Raymond came in. That kid'll be trouble one day. They all are, Carlos said, but trouble keeps us from falling asleep. Later that week, he met a senator at a quiet restaurant on Magazine Street. The place was old, peeling paint, crooked blinds, a piano that only knew half its keys. Perfect for conversation. Carlos, the senator said, swirling his wine, you're a problem for Washington. They can't prove anything, but they can't ignore you either. Carlos smiled. Then I've done something right. They'll come again, the senator warned. And next time, they won't bother with handcuffs. They'll go after your business, your people, your family. Carlos's voice stayed soft. Family's not paperwork, it's weather. It bends, it shifts, it survives. The senator leaned forward. You really think you can outlast Washington? I don't need to outlast it, Carlos said. I just need to outwait it. That night, back on his porch, he listened to the sound of the city winding down. Jazz floated through the air from somewhere deep in the quarter, lazy and sweet. He thought of all the men who'd stood across from him, politicians, rivals, lawmen, and how each one thought they could measure him by his height or his temper. But Carlos Marcello wasn't built for spectacle. He was built for survival. And survival, he knew, was just another word for patience. He closed his eyes, breathing in the thick Louisiana air. Let them come, he whispered. New Orleans still belongs to the quiet. The night answered him with a warm breeze that smelled like river mud and magnolia blossoms. The city had a restless gleam that winter, as if it knew change was in the air but couldn't decide whether to welcome it or hide. The streetcars rattled slower, the jazz grew moodier, and the smell of the river seemed sharper somehow, saltier, electric. Carlos Marcello felt it every morning when he stepped out onto the sidewalk. The rhythm of New Orleans was shifting, and even a man who lived by rhythm could feel the beat start to slip. The newcomers were easy to spot. They wore brighter suits, carried louder laughter, and talked about Las Vegas like it was a new religion. They came from the West with promises and numbers, casinos, hotels, air-conditioned dreams. They said New Orleans was ripe for the future. Carlos Marcello thought the future sounded noisy. Raymond sat across from him one afternoon in the back office, papers spread between them. They're calling themselves investors, he said, but they've got backing from the desert, Nevada money, real big. Carlos didn't look at the papers. Big doesn't last here. The humidity eats ambition faster than salt eats steel. They're setting up meetings, Raymond said. Politicians, bankers, everyone's curious. If they start buying the city, we won't recognize it in 10 years. Carlos leaned back, eyes half closed. Then we make sure they have to knock before they walk in. That night, the air was soft with fog. He took a drive down Canal Street, past the hotels with their glowing signs, past the men selling newspapers with headlines about prosperity and progress. On the corner, a young saxophonist played beneath a flickering lamp. The notes rose and fell, wild and searching, the kind of tune that carried both promise and warning. Carlos slowed the car, listening. The music reminded him of the city itself. Beautiful, stubborn, a little drunk. He dropped a bill into the boy's case and said, "Don't play too fast. The world catches up quick enough." The boy nodded, eyes wide. When he got home, the phone was already ringing. Rita answered, then passed it to him with a raised brow. "Las Vegas," she mouthed. He took the receiver. Marcello. The voice on the other end was slick, practiced. Mr. Marcello, name's Jack Primo. I represent a few gentlemen interested in doing business down south. We'd like to buy some waterfront property. Maybe open a club. Carlos lit a cigarette. There's plenty of land down here. You don't need me for that. We like to be polite, Primo said. Word is, nothing moves in Louisiana without your blessing. Carlos exhaled a curl of smoke. Then you heard wrong. The river doesn't need my permission to flow. The caller laughed too loud. Mr. Marcello, you're a legend. We just want to work with you, not against you. People who want to work with me don't usually call first, Carlos said, and hung up. 2 days later, a man in a white linen suit walked into the import office uninvited. He was tall, tanned, with a smile that could have been printed on a billboard. Mr. Marcello, he said warmly. Name's Jack Primo. I figured I'd say hello in person. Carlos didn't get up. You flew a long way to hear a short word. Jack grinned. You're cautious. I respect that. But there's room for both of us in this city. Vegas money, Louisiana charm. We could build something that lasts. Carlos studied him for a long moment. Everything lasts until it doesn't. Jack's grin faltered. You don't like new ideas? I like quiet ones, Carlos said. Jack leaned forward, lowering his voice. Listen, the Kennedys are after you. The whole country's watching. You think you can hold this place forever? Vegas can buy you a future. Carlos's gaze stayed level. The last man who offered to buy my future forgot to ask if I was selling. Jack held up his hands. No disrespect meant. Just business. Business is manners, Carlos said, and you're running low. Raymond appeared at the door then, silent but solid. Jack took the hint. He stood, straightened his jacket. You'll come around, Mr. Marcello. The world's getting smaller. Carlos nodded. That's what people say right before they trip. When the man left, the room felt lighter. Raymond shut the door quietly. He'll come back. They always do, Carlos said. Ambition doesn't know how to take no for an answer. Weeks turned into months. Vegas didn't go away. They just changed tactics. New restaurants appeared, new investors, new politicians, suddenly flush with campaign donations. The future had found its way into the quarter, dressed in neon and confidence. Carlos responded the way he always did, with patience. He bought property quietly, sponsored local events, made donations to the right churches. He met every new face with a handshake and a smile that revealed nothing. One evening at a charity gala, he found himself face to face with Jack Primo again. The man's tuxedo gleamed, his confidence louder than the band playing swing behind them. Mr. Marcello, Jack said, glass in hand. Glad to see you mingling. Maybe you're warming up to progress after all. Carlos looked at him for a beat, then smiled. Progress is just change wearing a fancy suit. Jack laughed. Then you should love it. You look good in suits. Carlos tilted his head. You play cards, Jack? Only when I can win. That's the problem with gamblers, Carlos said softly. They forget luck has a memory. He clinked his glass lightly against Jack's and moved on. Later that night, he drove alone to the waterfront. The city lights shimmered on the river like spilled whiskey. He leaned against the railing, listening to the hum of the current. He thought about what the man had said. The world getting smaller, the future arriving whether he liked it or not. Maybe it was true. Maybe the city would change, with or without him. But as long as he was breathing, it would change at his pace. He took out his notebook and wrote, in neat handwriting, the faster they run, the sooner they fall asleep. He folded the paper, tucked it into his coat pocket, and smiled. Good night, New Orleans, he whispered. You've still got rhythm left. The fog thickened over the river, swallowing the lights one by one, until only the soft sound of jazz from some faraway bar floated through the dark, steady, defiant, eternal. The humidity returned before sunrise, thick and wet as a promise the sky didn't plan to keep. New Orleans shimmered with a kind of nervous beauty, too bright in the day, too quiet at night. Carlos Marcello stood in his office watching condensation slide down the window pane. He had the sense that the city was trying to tell him something, only it had chosen a language of fog and half-finished sentences. Raymond set a newspaper on the desk. "Vegas again," he said. "They bought another block downtown, calling it Modern Development." Carlos didn't look up. Modern means new paint on old wood. "They got money, boss. Money talks louder than brass bands." "Money talks," Carlos said, "but it never listens." He folded the paper and reached for his jacket. "Let's take a drive." The drive took them out toward the riverfront, where cranes swung slow and workers shouted over the din. The smell of diesel and salt hung heavy in the air. Ships groaned against their moorings like tired animals. Carlos stepped out of the car, watching a group of young men in hard hats joke over their lunches. They were lean, quick, their laughter too sharp. "Different kind of crew these days," he said. Raymond nodded. "Vegas money pays on Fridays, ours pays in favors." "Favors last longer," Carlos murmured. He walked along the pier, the boards creaking beneath his shoes. "You hear the rhythm in that, Ray?" "The rhythm?" "The sound," Carlos said. "That creak, the boats, the men yelling. That's the heartbeat of this city. Vegas can build all the palaces they want, but they'll never hear this." That night, the quarter felt more alive than usual. Neon buzzed over doorways. The smell of fried shrimp and whiskey tangled in the air. Carlos sat in the corner of a small restaurant that had never once advertised itself, where the tablecloths were always clean and the piano never played too loud. Across from him sat Jack Primo again, the man from Las Vegas, wearing a smile that cost more than the suit he was in. "You gotta hand it to this city," Jack said. "It makes a man feel young." Carlos stirred his drink. "Youth is overrated. It ends the minute you start counting." Jack laughed. "You and your poetry, Carlos. I swear you should be writing books, not ledgers." "I'm in the business of keeping stories quiet," Carlos said. Jack leaned forward. "Look, I'll be straight with you. Vegas wants in. We can bring real growth here. Tourism, hotels, casinos. You'll get a cut, of course. You'd be at the top of the table." Carlos took his time lighting a cigarette. The flame flickered against his calm face. "You ever see a poker table in a storm, Jack?" Jack blinked. "Can't say I have." "The cards stick together," Carlos said, "and the chips slide right off. The game doesn't stop, but nobody wins. That's what your Vegas sounds like to me. A game in a storm." Jack smiled, but it was tight now. "You can't hold back the future." Carlos's eyes softened. "The future doesn't ask for permission. It just forgets who paid for the lights." They sat there for a while, listening to the piano drift through the room. Then Carlos said, almost kindly, "Enjoy the quarter while you can, Jack. It's polite to visitors." Later that night, Carlos stood on his porch watching a thunderhead roll in from the Gulf. The lightning flashed white against the swamp. He could feel the air thicken, charged but not yet dangerous. Rita stepped out with a folder in hand. "Reports from the banks," she said. "They're lending to the Vegas men. Everyone wants in." He flipped through the pages, nodded once, and handed them back. "You know what makes a good garden, Rita?" She frowned. "I'm not sure, sir." "Shade," he said. "Too much sun burns everything." He lit a cigarette, the match hissing in the damp air.